Hi, it's Ralph Ranalli. Welcome back to the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity podcast. We're excited to be joined this episode by another co-director of the EFIP network, Princeton University economist Atif Mian. Born and raised in Pakistan, Mian came to the United States to study math and engineering at MIT, where he discovered economics and eventually earned his PhD. After the 2008 financial crisis, Mian rose to prominence with his groundbreaking research on the relationship between debt, the financial sector, wealth concentration, and the macroeconomy, which culminated in his influential book, House of Debt, with colleague Amir Sufi. If he's learned one key lesson in his research, Mian says it would be that distribution matters, and that today's record levels of economic inequality represent not just a moral issue, but a serious threat to the functioning and stability of the macroeconomy. Mian says the massive inequality at the top of the wealth pyramid, where the top 1% of Americans now control as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined, has created a system that is dangerously out of balance. His research has found that the savings rate among the bottom 50% is effectively zero, while the top 1% are able to bank 40% of their income. All that money being removed from the economy, he says, has to go somewhere. So where's it going? Not where it's needed, Mian says. Instead of channeling it into productive uses like investments in businesses and factories, the financial sector is pushing it out as unproductive consumer debt at a rate that isn't sustainable. And in fact, U.S. consumer debt rose to a record $18.6 trillion in the third quarter of last year. But all that mountain of debt also pushes a non-virtuous cycle, first requiring lower and lower interest rates to sustain itself. Then those low interest rates drive up asset prices, pushing even more wealth to the rich people who are disproportionately owners of them. Finally, perverse regulatory incentives on lending are pushing even more capital into unproductive debt. It's a system that is dangerously out of balance, Mian says. To rebalance it will require looking at regulations, incentives, inherited wealth, and particularly taxation, especially on unproductive assets. Atif Mian joins us to talk about how we got here economically and ways we might be able to get to a better, more sustainable place. So let's go. So welcome, Atif. It's terrific to have another of the founders and co-directors of Economics for Inclusive Prosperity on the podcast. So it's great to see you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I love it because it gives me insight into the group and what it's trying to accomplish from like the source, like the very beginnings. I hope you don't mind, but I'd love to chat first about you a little bit and sort of your journey.
Yeah.
You've had an interesting path from
Yeah.
basically you were a young man coming from Pakistan to MIT with an intent to study engineering. And then you ended up as an influential economist who's interested in the connection between inequality and the macroeconomy as a research focus. Can you give me the sort of the interesting but abridged version of that path, like how you got from that point A to point B?
Absolutely. I think it's fair to say that for someone who works in macro and finance, my path is a bit atypical. As you said, I came from Pakistan, wanting to do, as everyone else, I imagine, science engineering at MIT. I did math and computer science. I had no idea what economics is all about. But the great thing about education in the US is that they make you take all kinds of courses. And I just fell in love with economics in the following sense. It had all the questions that were the most interesting, about the society, especially coming from Pakistan. I was always like, why are we so poor? Why can't we be like the US or Canada or whatever? And because I liked math and sort of the technical aspects of it, this was like a perfect combination. I could ask the questions that I always wanted to ask, and I could use the tools that I had learned or I had some comparative advantage in terms of the quantitative understanding of those questions. So I dived right in, lucky enough to get into MIT PhD program after my undergrad. But I was like so sure I would do development. And so that's what I did. Actually, my Advisor was Abhijit Banerjee, the famous Nobel laureate, uh, and I did development. I just happened to sort of start working on banking in developing countries, and as life would have it, sort of went more into finance. But because of my development background, I would say I was always interested in sort of the big picture, macro level questions, and so I kept gravitating towards it. Um, and I think my training helped in sort of allowing me to think from first principles, even though I was not trained as a macroeconomist. And then also the other aspect of my training was using granular micro level data to answer kind of all kinds of questions. And I thought, why not use these techniques to answer macro questions, which wasn't as much the fashion back then when I was kind of grappling with these issues. And then, the big break came with the financial crisis. And I remember like thinking before this summer, a reporter from the New York Times one asked, like, how come you from Pakistan are ahead of the curve in? I'm like, well, I just focused on emerging markets, and the US became an emerging market, in terms of having those financial crises. So it kind of fell in my lap. It's not like I was that smart, but as always, you want to be luckier than want to be smart.
Yeah. So it's very economics for inclusive prosperity, that kind of wanting to me, that sort of ethos of wanting to lens out and really talk about the bigger underlying macro problems. When you're working on those kind of problems that are a little bit further down the line, you're wondering like why are things the way they are, right? And I know you believe that inequality isn't just a moral and a social problem, but it's a macroeconomic and a financial stability problem. And that was a real eye opener for me. When did
Yep.
you start, when in your sort of research and studies did you start understanding that that could be true?
Yeah, great question. So first of all, if you work in the area or the intersection of macroeconomics and financial markets, one thing becomes clear to you very early on, and I think everyone knows this, so I'm not saying anything controversial, which is distribution really matters. So, for example, the reason a financial crisis can have a big impact on the macroeconomy is because financial crises can can take a lot of value away from the banking sector that really need that net worth to lend to households and firms subsequently and so on. So this notion that distribution matters has always been there in the background. What has not been there as much in the background is how much or how it matters, number one, and which aspect of inequality really matters. And when I started looking at that question, what really struck me is the following. It's not just that more generally inequality matters, it's really inequality at the top. Extreme inequality is what really matters, number one. And number two, the reason it really matters is because the most important action that you and I, economic action that you and I take, is like the consumption saving decision. We all get some income through our assets or labor. How much of that income do we end up spending by buying groceries, by going on vacation, things like that, versus we save and we sort of put back in the financial system? And what really struck me, again, it kind of has always been there, but it really, that is sort of the start of this kind of journey on the inequality side, is how different that consumption saving behavior is for people who are very rich. And now I'm thinking top 1% or even further in that. They can't spend it all. And so they have to. And so so now when you combine that simple observation with the simple fact that there has been this incredible rise in extreme inequality. Okay, that money has to go somewhere, and that's a macroeconomic question. So that sort of led me into it. The other part of your question was, okay, inequality is a sort of obviously a sort of a loaded question, if you will. It has a lot of political, social implication, moral, philosophical implications. It's all extremely important. But I've learned one thing in life: understand your lane and understand your comparative advantage, right? And so the question is, as an economist, am I adding much value if I am the next nth one to pontificate on the moral value of whatever? And the answer is, of course, I have my views, don't get me wrong, and I feel very strongly about them like any other human being. And I hope that I have a core set of moral values and all of that. But when it comes to engaging with the public and trying to make an argument, I wanted to focus on the economic system and let people understand, in addition to everything else around inequality, why does it matter for the macroeconomy as a whole, as a system? And that's the last comment I'll make, which is what I realized, and to like great satisfaction, it's a kind of it's my body of work that I really value a lot, is this understanding that when that consumption saving decision is so much different at the very top because they save a lot, it can have really grave and important macroeconomic consequences through its impact on debt, on interest rate, and on the broader functioning of the society. And the key philosophical insight that comes out of it for me is this notion of balance. Just like in nature, like in an ecosystem, I remember my differential equation, class on differential equations, where they would talk about the predator and prey system, which you can model as a differential equation. And the key thing was the sense of balance, which is if you have too many predators, the prey will run out, but then the predator cannot survive without the prey. And so you need this balance between the two for the jungle to survive, so to speak. And it's exactly the same sense of perfect balance that you need in the economy for it to function well. And we have lost that balance,
Right.
in my view.
I think that is a really nice segue because it brings us, I think, to your recent paper, The Savings Glut of the Rich, and where you talk about how rising wealth inequality and some greater financial liberalization have caused global debt to surge and interest rates to fall since the 1980s, which is pushing the system out of balance, that sort of equation out of balance. Can you explain for us how that mechanism works?
Absolutely. The starting point is what I have already mentioned, which is that the super rich, again, think the top 1%, they save at a much higher rate than the rest of the population.
I
They
think
save something like half the income.
like over 40. I think your paper was like over 40%,
Exactly.
and then the next 9% saves maybe 20%. But the
Exactly.
savings rate for the bottom 50% is effectively zero, right?
It's effectively zero. It's hand to mouth. They're literally this what we call hand to mouth. So that's the basic fact. How people choose to, everybody is free to save as much as they want, of course, given your income. And so that's how they behave. And the question is, okay, again, not making any moral judgment on it, what are the macroeconomic implications of that? And the thing is, if in that world, when you raise inequality as it has risen since the 1980s, you're going to have a larger and larger surplus of savings because it's more of the pie is going to the small segment of the population that is saving at a much higher rate. And so things have to balance again, coming back to, demand has to equal supply. That's a basic law of economics. So the question is, where do those savings go? Now, this is where the financial sector come in. So let me make one observation that I think is very important. If I just told you that given all of these dynamics, the amount of saving, the gross amount of saving in the economy has expanded. Let's say it's doubled. It could have gone into one of two different directions. The first could have been the case that the financial sector takes those surplus savings and it lends them for productive investment, more capex, more greater employment or better employment, more infrastructure, things of that nature. It could have done that. There is nothing theoretically stopping the economy from doing that. The fact of the matter is, and so that's one important observation that I think we need to understand from a policy perspective, from a deeper structural perspective. None of that additional money, which was, we are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars every year, huge sums of money. The big puzzle is almost none of that additional amount was channeled by the financial sector into productive investment. So that's kind of observation number one, and kind of a damning judgment, in my view, if you will, about what the financial sector as a whole is doing. Let's take that as a given. And this is where the problems start to emerge from a system perspective. If that's what they had done, I think we would have been living in a much different world. You and I would have been having a very different conversation. But because that did not happen, the question now still remains. Now you have these hundreds of billions of dollars in surplus saving. If you cannot put it to productive use, it still needs to go somewhere. And that's sort of a very important macro point, which is if it does not go anywhere, the whole system will literally collapse. We economists use jargon like liquidity trap, secular stagnation, things of that nature. But what that basically means is the system must absorb those savings. That says what for the reader or the listener, that's the important thing to understand. It must go somewhere. And so the financial system tries to do that. And so what has happened is the financial sector has pushed essentially all of that additional surplus into a debt and equally importantly, unproductive debt. What do I mean by that? By unproductive debt, I mean debt that on the other end has financed not investment, which would have been good, but consumption expenditures. And there are two types of consumption expenditures that this debt by and large has financed. I would say in the first phase of this expansion that runs from the 80s until 2008, the great financial recession. In that first phase, the bulk of that financing of unproductive debt has been to finance household consumption expenditure. So this is like the big boom in household debt, consumer credit,
Right.
mortgages, all of that financed that huge consumption boom, private consumption boom. And post 2008, it shifted to financing again consumption expenditures, but this time borrowed by the government and spent through salaries and all of that into the economy.
Right. That was because the consumers after the housing crash, they pulled in their economic horns and they didn't want to, they pulled back their spending. So you had to have the government step in to keep up that, pushing that debt and keep the demand side going. Right.
Exactly. And this allows me to circle back to my point about the importance of balance. That's what the economy is actually trying to do, which is, as I said, if you have the savings, the economy must absorb it somehow. Otherwise, we have a massive problem. And just like you have changes in pressures, the weather system, that's the planet trying to equilibrate. So one part does not get too hot or too cold. That's basically what's happening. In the same way, through the price mechanism, and one important price is the interest rate in the economy, the broader macroeconomy tries to balance or equilibrate by trying to then absorb those savings in the way that we have seen it, which is interest rates get lower. So this is the other paper that we wrote called Indebted Demand with Ludwig Straub at Harvard, which shows that once you have this system where these additional savings are being channeled into unproductive debt, you have, of course, a rise in debt. But the more important and subtle insight is that the only way that debt can sustain itself is through lower and lower interest rates.
Right.
And the reason for that actually is very simple. If you are the one lending to me, Ralph, and I'm borrowing all that additional amount, the rate, the interest rate at which I'm borrowing is typically above the growth rate, the average growth rate of my income. So I'm borrowing something which I must pay back to you in interest at a rate above my income growth. That doesn't square up. Something has to give. So the only way, again, the system tries to find a balance. And how? You have to lower your interest rate more and more over time. And so this logic then ends up also explaining what otherwise has been a very important fact, which has otherwise been hard to explain, which is both this rise in incredible amounts of debt in the global economy as a share of GDP and this falling interest rates, this downward persistent pressure on interest rates. And we have argued that through these mechanisms that I've tried to highlight, it is the rise in inequality, extreme inequality once again, that has been important for these explaining these very important dynamics. I'll just end on that, re-emphasizing one. This process is trying to rebalance the economy. But if the structural problem of extreme inequality does not go away, ultimately you're going to have a serious problem. And so that's why I sometimes say, yeah, the economy is trying to make it work, but I sometimes joke, this is no way to live. As a society, this is no way to live. And I just hope that somehow I'm able to put that point across, that it is for our collective good, that there are limits to how unequal the society gets.
Right. So let's go back to 2008, because that's a very interesting period where I think a lot of these sort of learnings, it's kind of a crucible in which a lot of these learnings emerged. Because there was also, in addition to the interest rates, there was also another factor, right, which was kind of inflated asset prices and how that affected consumer behavior. What can you sort of bring those inflated asset prices into the equation, and how they affected consumer spending, both in among like the lower percentiles of the wealth scale, both before and after the housing crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. This causes sometimes a lot of confusion in people's minds. But it's actually quite straightforward if you continue to follow the logic of what I said earlier, which was rising inequality. Remember in that story what is going on? Rising inequality is generating these surplus savings, which in turn are pushing higher and higher levels of debt, and in particular, debt for financing unproductive consumption expenditures. Precisely because that debt is financing unproductive expenditures, a very important implication of that in equilibrium for the macroeconomy is that interest rates have to push lower and lower, right? Okay, now let's come to asset prices. What does all of this mean for asset prices? The very simple relationship between asset prices and interest rates is that one is the inverse of the other. That is to say, when interest rates go down, asset prices naturally rise. You can call it a bubble or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's actually not a bubble in that sense. And so, one of the consequences, this is partly why I say this is no way to live, because one of the consequences of relying on this debt finance consumption with interest rates going lower and lower is that that system also becomes frothier and frothier in terms of asset prices. And that's exactly what has happened. So, for example, and this is the thing that confuses people at times. If you think, oh, asset prices were out of whack just before, and there was some irrational exuberance bubble, whatever, before the house prices were really too high and it burst, and that's the end of story. No, prices are back where they used to be, for example, house prices. And my point is that's because the underlying problem was not just a simple bubble that burst, but this structural problem that kept pushing interest rates lower. So that local disturbance around 2008, actually, once that went away, prices went back up to that level. That's the way to understand this, this mechanism. And so, you know, like I said earlier, when I said this is no way to live, there is an irony here. Let me bring that out. The irony here is the following. If I'm able to keep people's attention up to this point, what is happening is in this narrative I'm building, that it is this rise in extreme inequality that is generating debt, pushing interest rates lower, and hence pushing asset prices up. There's an irony here. I hope people get that. The irony is people getting richer is causing the system to do what I just said, which makes them even richer. Because falling interest rates now, because who owns the wealth? Who owns most of the assets? Obviously, the people on average were much richer. And this fall in interest rate, essentially, that's the key idea. If rising inequality pushes interest rates down, ironically, it makes the super rich even richer. Their stock valuations go up, the land they own, the land valuation goes up. And so this and let me now I said I'll stay in my lane, and I pretty much will mostly, but let me highlight one other aspect of that, which I think has become an extreme problem in the political environment that we live in today.
Right.
Across the aisle, it's not about right or left, which is the extreme influence of this exorbitant levels of wealth in politics. Because it's free money for them. I mean, I was already a billionaire, now I'm a trillionaire. It's like if a fall in interest rate doubles my wealth, I can now use it to do all kinds of things. It's like I'm obviously, as I've already said, there is no way. I used Jeff
Right.
Bezos recently had a wedding, right? Everybody talked about it, how exorbitant the wedding was. How did he expend? I wish him and his wife all the best, and they happily live ever after again. But my point was, I would joke that he's spending too little on his wedding. He needs the problem with Jeff Bezos is that his income is so high he cannot spend enough,
Right. And
right?
I
And
yeah, and I think that's ultimately a big question that I think Economics for Inclusive Prosperity, EFIP, sometimes we call it, is trying to answer, which is um, at what point does wealth stop becoming wealth and it becomes power, right? Um, and how do you deal with that disparity of power that comes along with extreme wealth and its effects on democracy and its effects on, these other things that we're trying to bring into the equation in terms of what's talked about and what's considered um, by quote unquote mainstream economics, right? We're trying to lens out again and to see that bigger picture of the effects. If you don't mind, though, can we just take a little sort of side turn onto a side road? Because one of the things is that I think is really fascinating um, is the extent to which your work and the extent to which it's helped you become sort of an economic empiricist versus just a pure theorist is the availability of these large data sets that you work with. That they've influenced your work. They've enabled they've enabled a deeper understanding of these issues, and they allow you to empirically test theories that were theories, but they just sort of became conventional economic wisdom. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what sort of myth busting, I guess, for a lack of better term,
yeah,
those big data sets have allowed you to do?
yeah, that's been a very important part of my work. And as I've alluded to it earlier, when I was telling you about my background, that because I came from an atypical background into asking macro questions, my training in development and particularly the micro-empirical training, even though development questions are also a big picture, there was this tendency to appeal to these kinds of methods to answer those pictures. So I was like, and I remember this thought early on. I'm like, okay, I want to think about consumption responses and so on. And the tradition at that point was largely to just work with time series data, right? And with this idea that, okay, I need to talk about the economy, so I just need to look at the aggregate GDP numbers and so on. So you had this sort of literature in a lot of sort of looking at the VARs, looking at time series data. I'm throwing some technical jargon out there. But broadly, there was this notion that if you want to study the broader economy, you have to kind of look at the aggregate data, and that's just one number at any given point in time. Um, Now, the problem is that when, as an economist, you ask the question of why is the economy going up? Why is it going down? Why are people getting laid off? And you think through various hypotheses. It could be because of A, because of B. The statistical power of just aggregate time series data, it's basically too little to separate whether it's A or B. And it's very obvious when you think about it that the granularity of the data actually allows you to further parse out story A versus story B by saying, okay, does story A versus B have different implications at a more granular level? I'll give you one small example of that, which was very much sort of in my mind at that. Now I'm talking like before the 2008 crisis. So, early 2000s, mid 2000s, early 2000s. Greenspan is the Fed chairman. And people are asking, they're seeing all these kind of boom in housing and people borrowing. And so they're like, why are people doing this? And I remember hearing his response a few times where he's saying, oh, we are not too worried about this excessive growth in credit because we think this is related to something else happening in the economy, which is higher productivity growth. So if in an economy you have higher productivity growth, now what is he thinking? I'm saying, okay, he's making a perfectly internally consistent argument. He's a smart guy. But it has, is it actually the case? That's a test. Now, to test that hypothesis, you have to go to micro level data, because the hypothesis is saying, look, people are borrowing because they expect to be richer in the future. You can test that because not everybody is borrowing with the same intensity. Are people who are borrowing more, are they the ones getting richer? Now, this connects back to inequality, and because what we know is that it's not the middle class that's been getting richer proportionately, it's the rich that have been getting richer disproportionately. And so that started, okay, let me try and get some more granular data to see if this assertion of Mr. Greenspan is correct or not. And so that partly sort of got started all of that research agenda that we then worked on around the Great Recession.
So your book, House of Debt, received a lot of acclaim within economic circles, but there's also pushback from people like Timothy Geithner, who is sort of downplaying your assertion that debt relief, and I want to start really talking about debt and what you call the addiction to debt, right? That debt relief can be could have been a more effective remedy than the other financial interventions, bailouts, and that it can be in times of economic crisis. Can you explain that? What are your main arguments there for
Yeah.
in favor of debt relief as a prescription for helping the things get better?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I would strongly push back on any assertion that you could, especially in hindsight. I think that one of the big mistakes of the Obama administration was that they misunderstood the importance of exactly this point, which is in the middle of a crisis, which is driven by highly indebted households, providing relief to those indebted households. So I will just reframe, it's not necessarily debt relief, it's relief for the indebted households, because there are many different ways you can do that. Not necessarily just write down the level of debt. No. The important point is providing relief to the indebted household. Why and how? What the administration effectively did, while they bail out bankers at a very high cost at that time for the economy, justified. I understand the argument. I'm not saying they should not have done that. What I'm saying is that logic is entirely incomplete if you don't, at the same time, and for exactly the same economic logic, also provide relief to the indebted homeowners. Now, let's count the mistakes that were made. The first and the most important mistake in my mind was forcing over 4 million homes into foreclosure. It's an obvious first thing to do, which is because who's going to buy 4 million homes? That's only going to make the problem worse, and so on. It's not moral hazard. It wasn't their individual fault that the market was crashing. You're in the middle of a crisis. You need to put a moratorium. By the way, this is exactly what the US government did the second time we had a big crisis, which was the pandemic. And it was absolutely the right thing to do. It was the Trump administration at the time. Whoever did it, kudos to them. They did the right thing, and we saw the advantage of that. We never had a crisis and so on. You put a moratorium on foreclosure and things like that, especially when you're providing so much. You had so much leverage over the banking sector. You were putting all of the big bankers in a room. You could have negotiated better terms and said, don't push these homes into foreclosure in various ways. It could have been done. So I think it has to be recognized. It's important that we learn from our mistakes. I'm not political, doesn't matter it's right or left. But I think what is important is that we learn from our mistakes. And again, the key mistake was relief should have been provided. Lower interest rates were not passing through to those homeowners because they could not get their mortgages refinanced easily. Their houses were being put into foreclosure, which worsened the unemployment problem because it reduced demand even further. It reduced the value of their neighbors who may not have been defaulting, but now they're feeling the squeeze of lower housing prices. Everybody is becoming more cautious by cutting back their spending. Those are exactly the wrong dynamics. And so in subsequent work, we show all of this, that all of that multiplied and amplified the overall cost of the crisis. It could have been a lot less if the government had favored providing relief to the indebted homeowners in different ways. That just mean writing off the debt. No, there are many different ways, and we know how to do that. Just like you know how to restructure the balance sheet of the banking sector. Should have been done, wasn't done. Big mistake, big cost to all of us.
Right. So getting back to that credit or the credit addiction, which is still underway, right? What are the long-term consequences you think if something isn't done to address that addiction to credit, and if we don't rebalance the economy? What do you see happening in the long term?
Okay. One way, the many different threads to your question. Actually, let me try to touch upon what I think are the sort of the main threads of that question. Think of what this means. You know, you're kind of pushing more on debt. Asset prices are rising as a result of that. If that leads to even more wealth inequality, they're becoming more powerful. And first of all, I think it's important to understand that this is why I say more broadly, this is no way to live. We are and this we are seeing the political consequences of that. For example, something that worries me a lot is, you know, democracy is about not just one vote, one person, one vote. It's about one person, similar voice in the system. But now the money in politics has so disproportionately amplified the voices of the few versus the many because of money in politics, number one. But the other thing, equally or perhaps even worse, is through the use of algorithms of these digital platforms, how certain voices are amplified and others squashed very deliberately. It's like I've been on social media. I used to tweet a lot more than I do now, partly because of this. It's like depressing. And so I think it's a big problem, number one. And that's again, all of that is related to the. But let me come now just to the pure kind of the boring nuts and bolts, macroeconomic nuts and bolts of this addiction to debt and the problems with that. The problem with that is, and we wrote a recent paper called the Goldilocks fiscal theory of government debt, which is the following: as you push, it's like pushing on a string. As you push on more and more debt, you ultimately have to rely on government debt. That's the first of all the key thing, because you have to generate demand, you have to generate expenditures, and then because you have saturated the private households, they cannot borrow more. You now have to rely on government debt, and theoretically you can, but it's literally like pushing on a thread, or maybe like balancing yourself on a string, you know, um, because the government needs to run a deficit to generate demand. That's addiction part. But it also faces the other side of the constraint, which is it must not borrow too much, or otherwise inflation or interest rate or both will start to get out of control. And we saw that with the COVID experiment or the COVID experience. A number of, you know, so for example, I can tell people, if people are interested in this question, they should just go and Google sovereign bond yields for Switzerland versus the US and follow the trend before and after COVID. It's like, you know, they have separated since COVID. Switzerland has not experienced a rise in sovereign borrowing. US, of course, has. The key difference is that the US spent a lot, and in all likelihood, too much. This is the problem. This is again no way to live. You can solve certain problems if you calibrate your fiscal policy just right. But getting fiscal policy just right is next to impossible, especially in the current political environment, you know, where it's easy to ramp up spending, but how, like, you know, how do you ramp it down? What spending do you cut? Whose taxes do you raise? The answer often is you can't solve that problem, and then you run into problems. So I think the problem, these are again some of the, what is the structural issue here? Let's go back to the basics. We can get into the weeds of, is government spending too much, Biden spent too much, or Trump is spending too, whatever. Like those are just political. I know they make for good political talk shows. But that's not the main issue. The main issue is that the economy is structurally imbalanced. We need to work on that.
So how do you work on that? Like, what would be if someone said, okay, Atif, you're in charge of rebalancing the economy, what would the top two or three policy prescriptions you would put forward if if all of a sudden you
Yeah.
had the power to kind of start pushing things back in the direction of balance, the way um, that you say
Yeah.
is so important?
I think there's some important things that need to be done. A, on the demand side of the economy, and then B, on the supply side of the economy. So let me talk about both separately. Let me start with the supply side, actually. Um, Remember, as I was building the narrative, one of the key ingredients, components of this narrative was the inability of the economy to channel savings for more productive investment purposes. That's a real problem. That's the supply side. Those are all supply side issues. There is a lot of, in my view, the evidence has been building up over and over that the economy around the world, especially in the US, it faces restrictions, supply side restrictions, driven by regulation, driven by zoning laws, driven by the ability of a minority to block certain things which are good for infrastructure. Like I live in New Jersey, like look at New Jersey transit. It's like hasn't changed since the 70s or 80s. It's like depressing, right? But there are so many, that's what I'm saying. There are like so many examples like that. And there is more and more, like many people have now these books on this, right? A number of people, abundance and all that stuff.
Right.
And so I think there's that pure supply side. I think all of that we need to go in and we need to do some serious supply side reforms to boost investment. So that's number one. Now let me come to before I go to the demand side, I'll come to taxation on the demand side. But before I go there, let me now talk about sort of the intermediation, the financial side of it. I think we have made some big mistakes, first order mistakes, thinking about regulation of the financial sector. Let me just give you one example, which is Basel regulation. So, Basel regulation, for the audience, these are rules that are enforced upon by supervisors for all banks around the world. It's kind of this unified regulatory framework that banks around the world. Now, these Basel rules essentially incentivize banks what kind of loans to give. That's one way to think about it. And so these Basel rules would say, for example, to the banks that you have capital, your equity on the balance sheet, and that equity is charged because you don't want banks to be over levered. So if they lend too much, leverage increases, that's where these Basel regulations come in. But here's the kicker in Basel regulation. They charge equity or capital not equally based on whether they are lending to you and I, the government, whether they are lending against land or whether they are lending to new small, medium businesses, for example. The Basel regulations say that if you're lending to effectively lending to small, medium businesses, we will charge a much higher, the risk weights will be larger. That is to say, effectively, we will charge a much higher slice of your equity against that lending to small businesses. But you know what? If you lend against very high valuations of land in Manhattan and you give a commercial loan against that, we'll consider that very low risk, very little capital to be charged against that. So, guess what do you think banks are going to do? They can get much higher levered return on lending against land value as opposed to lending to what really matters for the economy, which is business. We have it upside down. Like, why? So this is again, I mean, this is like the very first order thing. There's no economic logic in my mind for doing things the way they have been done. I have a political story for why things have gone. There is a certain special interest that wants to do things the way. But we need to think about collective interest when we are designing regulation. Okay, so supply side, financial, that's my second piece. Let me get to my third set of policies. Now that you have made me the czar in charge of the global economy. So my third would be on the demand side, and that comes on the taxation side. And I think the whole taxation system needs to be reformed to rebalance the economy. How? First, labor taxes, especially on lower and middle, or even upper middle class, they need to come down. Payroll taxes, labor income tax in general. Now, because it's about rebalancing. I'm not trying to raise more revenue, I'm trying to rebalance. Where should taxes go up? I think taxes need to go up on things like capital gain, especially capital gain on like idle capital, if you will. Estate inheritance, estate taxes, that's a big issue. We do need to think about wealth taxes more seriously, especially on the types of unproductive assets. So, for example, people on the right or left, where there is Stiglitz or Milton Friedman, they've all agreed that taxing land is efficient. There's a number of assets. So there are digital land assets today that can be taxed the same way, right? So because we don't have time, I won't go into further, but I think the system of taxation needs to be rebalanced. The key idea is lowering taxes on productive investment and also taxes on productive physical investment. So my earlier example of Basel regulation, it's an effective tax on productive physical investment. I'm an economist. I firmly believe in efficiency and so on. But we have those incentives upside down in many different, and so we need to realign those incentives.
Yeah, the incentives go to the unproductive and not to the productive. So this has been incredibly enlightening and interesting and fun. So I got to ask, what's next for you in terms of where you want to take this, where you want to follow this thread and take your research? And what do you think might be some promising other unexplored avenues for other up and coming economists to explore, people who want to sort of follow this path that you're trailblazing?
Well, my first advice to young people is don't listen to people like me. And I think that's one advantage I've had, which is I didn't know much. I didn't know much about macro or so on. And so I just thought from first principles, right? And I think that would be my first advice to young people is to think from first principles about the big questions and don't be too influenced by whatever the current paradigm is suggesting as the answer. But put that aside, think about the big question and work from first principles and say, okay, if I did not know anything and I wanted to understand this question, how would I think about it? What kind of evidence would convince me of this? And so the only place where I can nudge is about what are the big questions. And I think those are many of those are like what is AI going to do to this distribution, and then what is our response if it makes winner take all even more winner take all, which I think is quite likely to happen. I mean, we were talking about rebalancing. That's going to further unbalance the economy. So I think that's a very serious question. That question, by the way, goes very deeply, is very deeply aligned to the sense of legal frameworks, because ultimately it's law that gives value to property, right?
Right.
I can write a law that says your shirt is mine. All of a sudden, my, and so this is, so it's about, and so I think how do we apportion rights? So there are a whole range of, the other big question is when are markets good and when are they not good? That's a whole very fundamental question. This notion that markets always work is of course wrong. I can give you tons of example. For example, digital media, only one platform can exist because of network externalities. Who should own that platform? If in full markets, the richer person will own that platform. Literally, like that's the what's going to be the outcome. Because the richest person can pay the highest price for that one platform that we must have sit on. But then he will do whatever he wishes with that platform. We are literally living in that world. That's not a good world to live in if you want, democracy and that sort of. So that those are very serious questions of mechanism design, right? How do you design rules of the game, which goes into constitutional design, the law? This is a very fundamental. And I think we live in very exciting times from that perspective, that it's opening up the space to go back to the very like moral philosophy, if you will, going back to those deeper questions of how we want to organize ourselves as a society, so we deliver not just economic growth, but we also deliver the values that we need to aspire towards. And that, maybe, it motivated us to kind of think about putting these group together of economists for inclusive prosperity. Because that's and going back to like when you asked like why did I become an economist, and like that's what motivated me. Like I couldn't care less whether stock prices are going up or down. What really motivated me, like how should we live as a society? What makes certain societies better? This is the beauty of economics in my mind, is it tells you when and under what circumstances the sum is bigger than the parts. It's really economics that, it's like we use different terms for that: externality, this and that, general equilibrium. But at the end of the day, that's what it is all about. And I think for young economists and some of the older ones as well, I think this time is really exciting, that it's forcing us to think about those fundamentals. Any single, I very much dislike this socialism, capitalism, communism. This fight of isms is just total nonsense. Let's get real. Say, okay, you know what? Nothing is perfect. We live in an imperfect world. There are gray areas. We need to understand from first principles what conditions do we want to inculcate in the society so that the results those conditions deliver, they maximize our collective welfare, so that the sum is bigger than the parts. That's kind of the core excitement in my mind about what economics or the tools of economics can do potentially.
Right. I think I agree with you. I think this is a very exciting time in economics because we seem to be emerging from these orthodoxies and are able now to or in a mindset now where we can ask a lot more questions and fundamental questions, and yet at the same time we have these sort of newer empirical tools to sort of apply to them and learn deeper lessons. So I will be watching with great interest both your future and the future of the field. So thank you so much for being here
Thank you,
and
Ralph. Thank
sharing
you,
this with
Ralph.
us.
Really appreciate your questions and your time. Thank you.
The Economics for Inclusive Prosperity podcast is produced in collaboration with the Reimagining the Economy project at the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. The co-producer of this podcast is Tony Ditta. Please join us again in 2 weeks for another new episode featuring EFIP co-director and Harvard economist Stephanie Stancheva, the winner of the 2025 John Bates Clark Medal. We'll talk about her pioneering work on so-called zero-sum thinking and her innovative research methods that use large-scale social economic surveys and experiments to understand how people form their attitudes towards issues like taxation, trade, immigration, climate change, and social mobility. So thanks for listening. And if you like this podcast, please remember to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcasting app.